Welcome to the Cozy Storytime, your peaceful space to unwind and relax. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like the video for more cozy stories every night. So, where are you watching it from? And what are you doing right now? I hope you enjoyed this story. Close your eyes and let the world of fire and shadow drift into memory. Long ago, there was a place where dragons soared through crimson skies, where silver-haired kings and queens ruled a land forged by fire. A land of wonder, of power, of magic, Valyria. But nothing lasts forever. The doom came like a whisper in the wind, a tremor beneath the earth, a storm that no one could escape. Fire rained from the heavens, mountains split open, the mighty freehold was swallowed by flames, and an empire that had stood for centuries fell in a single day. Yet, in the ashes of ruin, embers still glow. Survivors sail across darkened waters, seeking a new dawn. Their dragons still breathe fire, their hearts still burn with the memory of home. This is their story. Welcome to the Doom of Valyria. Valyria was more than just a city. It was the heart of an empire, a place where the skies were alive with the beating wings of dragons, and the very earth pulsed with the power of fire and magic. For centuries, it had stood as a beacon of civilization, wealth, and knowledge. The freehold of Valyria stretched across vast lands, its influence touching every corner of Essos and beyond. The world knew no greater power, no greater majesty than that which resided in the land of dragons. The city itself was unlike any other. Built upon a peninsula where fire and stone intertwined, it was a place sculpted by both nature and the will of the Valyrians. Towering spires of fused stone, crafted through magic and dragonfire, rose high into the sky, their smooth black surfaces reflecting the light of the ever-burning flames from the volcanic mountains surrounding the city. Grand plazas sprawled between them, paved with marble so fine that the sunlight made them shine like water. Statues of dragons, their eyes adorned with gemstones, stood in honor of the mighty creatures that had brought the Valyrians to power. The streets of Valyria were always alive. Merchants from every corner of the freehold and beyond gathered in bustling marketplaces, offering silks from tea, spices from the summer isles, and rare stones from the deep mines of Sithorios. The scent of roasting meats and exotic fruits filled the air, mingling with the ever-present sulfuric breath of the volcanic forges. Smiths worked tirelessly in their workshops, forging weapons of Valyrian steel, the finest and deadliest ever crafted. They were artisans of the flame, their knowledge passed down from generation to generation, guarded as jealously as the secrets of dragon taming. Among them was a young man named Karen. Unlike many of the highborn dragon lords who ruled Valyria, Karen was of humbler origins. He was not of the great dragon-riding families, nor did he possess the gift of magic that so many of Valyria's elite wielded. But he was a smith, and that meant something in this city of fire. His father had been a forge master before him, and his grandfather before that. In their family, the forge was their dragon, and fire was their heritage. Karen's workshop was small compared to the grand forges of the nobility, but he was content with what he had. His hands were strong from years of shaping metal, his eyes sharp from studying the delicate artistry of Valyrian steel. It was a craft that demanded more than just skill, it required understanding. The metal was alive in its own way, and those who truly mastered it could create blades that never dulled, weapons that carried the whisper of magic within them. As he hammered away at a newly forged sword, the glow of molten metal casting a flickering light across his face, he listened to the city around him. The distant roar of dragons overhead, the shouts of traders haggling in the market, the rhythmic pounding of hammers from nearby forges, all of it was the music of Valyria. It was a city that never slept, never grew silent, always alive with the sounds of power and ambition. Despite his station, Karen had seen the heights of Valyrian society. The Dragon Lords were figures of legend, their bloodline traced back to the first tamers of dragons. They lived in palaces of unimaginable splendor, their robes woven with gold and silver, their eyes sharp with the knowledge of sorcery. They ruled not just with steel, but with fire, both in the sky and within their veins. It was said that true Valyrian blood burned hot, a gift from the dragons they had tamed. Among them, the most powerful houses formed the heart of the freehold's ruling class. Unlike the monarchies of Westeros, Valyria had no king. Instead, it was governed by the 40 families, an oligarchy of dragon lords who shaped the laws and dictated the course of empires. They were bound together by a common purpose, the expansion of Valyria's might. Karen had once glimpsed one of these great families up close. House Valyrian, one of the most esteemed bloodlines, had passed through the markets one evening, their dragons casting immense shadows as they soared overhead. The people had parted for them, their eyes filled with both reverence and fear. The Valyrians were known for their seafaring prowess, their fleet second only to their dragons in power. Their leader, Lord Aerion Valyrian, had been a striking figure, his silver hair catching the dying light of the sun, his violet eyes holding the weight of generations of dominion. Yet, for all their grandeur, there was something unsettling about the Dragon Lords. They were not like other men. Their connection to their dragons made them something else, something more, perhaps, but also something less. Their emotions were distant, their minds always working towards a future only they could see. Some whispered that they had grown too confident, that they believed themselves untouchable. Karen did not trouble himself with such thoughts. He had no dragon, no noble blood, no place among the rulers of Valyria. His world was the forge, the steel, the work of his hands. And yet, as he watched the Dragon Lords disappear down the street, he could not shake the feeling that something was changing. There was a weight in the air, a tension that had not been there before. Later that night, he sat outside his workshop, gazing toward the distant mountains. The 14 flames, the great volcanic range that had given Valyria its power, burned as they always had. Rivers of molten rock flowed from their peaks, feeding the earth with heat and magic. It was from these flames that Valyrian steel was born, from these depths that the first dragons had risen. They were the source of everything, their fire the foundation upon which Valyria had been built. And yet, something felt different. The flames seemed angrier, the eruptions more violent. There had always been rumblings beneath the ground, the occasional tremor that shook the city's foundations, but they were growing more frequent. The sky above the mountains flickered with an eerie glow, as though something within them was struggling to break free. Karen closed his eyes and listened. Beneath the sounds of the city, beneath the distant roars of dragons, he thought he could hear something else. A whisper. A murmur deep within the earth. A warning. But the people of Valyria did not listen to warnings. They were the rulers of the world, the masters of fire and stone. They believed themselves above the concerns of lesser men. As Karen sat in the warm glow of his forge, he could not have known that this was the last peaceful night Valyria would ever see. The city still stood, proud and unchallenged. The Dragon Lords still soared through the heavens, their beasts breathing fire into the darkening sky. The 14 flames still burned, feeding the land with their endless heat. But deep beneath the earth, something had begun to stir. And soon, all of Valyria would burn. The night sky over Valyria shimmered with the glow of dragon fire, as it had for centuries. The city, ever vibrant, pulsed with an energy that seemed eternal, its golden spires reflecting the flickering light from the forges and volcanic peaks beyond. Yet beneath this grand spectacle, beneath the surface of the city that never slept, there was something else, something unseen, something felt only in the quiet moments between the roaring flames and the rush of life. Karen awoke before dawn, his skin slick with sweat though the air outside was cool. The dream had come again, the same one that had haunted him for weeks. He had stood on the edge of a great chasm, black as the void, with fire licking at the sky around him. There had been voices, indistinct whispers curling through the air like smoke. They did not speak in any language he understood, but their meaning was clear. Something was coming. He sat up on his cot, rubbing a hand across his face. Dreams were dreams, nothing more. Yet he could not shake the unease that settled in his bones like cooling iron. He had lived his entire life in Valyria, born and raised within the forge, his hands shaped by the fire just as surely as the weapons he crafted. But never before had the city felt wrong. Outside, the streets were already stirring. Merchants prepared their wares, the scent of freshly baked bread mingling with the ever-present tang of sulfur in the air. Across the rooftops, dragon lords moved with practiced ease, their flowing robes catching the wind as they mounted their great beasts. The morning light shimmered across the scales of the creatures, their wings unfurling like banners of war. Karen stepped out of his small home, inhaling deeply. The forge was already warm, the embers from last night's work still glowing in the hearth. He should get to work, he told himself. There were always swords to temper, daggers to polish, armor to mend. But his feet carried him elsewhere. He found himself moving toward the eastern edge of the city, where the land sloped downward toward the sea. It was quieter here, away from the great halls of the dragon lords and the sprawling markets. The air smelled different, fresher somehow, as though the ocean itself was trying to reach past the mountains of fire to whisper something unheard. A figure stood at the edge of the cliffs, gazing out toward the horizon. Karen hesitated, recognizing her even from a distance. Valina, a woman of high birth, though not one of the ruling families. Unlike the dragon lords, she carried herself with a kind of quiet dignity, unburdened by arrogance. Her long silver hair was unbound, flowing freely in the wind. She had always seemed different, though Karen had never spoken with her beyond passing courtesies. "You feel it too," she said without turning. Karen blinked, caught off guard. "Feel what?" She finally turned, her violet eyes studying him. The change in the air. The way the flames burned hotter, wilder. She looked past him toward the mountains in the distance, where the 14 flames raged as they always had. "Something is shifting beneath us." Karen frowned. "The mountains have always burned." "Yes, but not like this." She took a step closer, lowering her voice. "There are those who have seen things. Visions of fire consuming everything. Dreams of the ground splitting open, swallowing the city whole." A chill ran down Karen's spine. He had told no one of his own dreams, but now they did not seem so unique. He had always thought them to be the workings of an overactive mind, the result of too many nights spent near the heat of the forge. But if others had seen the same, Valyria seemed to sense his thoughts. "You've seen them too." Karen hesitated, then gave a slow nod. "Yes. But dreams mean nothing." "Sometimes they do," she countered. "Especially in Valyria." There was truth in that. The Dragon Lords often spoke of prophecy, of visions that came to those with the blood of old Valyria running through their veins. But Karen had no dragon, no magic. He was no one. So why had he seen them? A distant tremor rumbled beneath their feet, faint but unmistakable. It was over in an instant, but Karen saw how Valina's expression hardened. "You should leave," she said suddenly. Karen stared at her. "Leave? Valyria?" He almost laughed. "This is my home. It won't be for long." Her words carried no malice, only certainty. It should have been absurd, unthinkable. Valyria was the greatest civilization the world had ever known. It had stood for centuries, unchallenged, untouchable. To suggest it could fall was to speak madness. But deep in his gut, Karen felt something stir, an instinct honed from years of working metal, of knowing when something was about to break. Another tremor shook the ground, stronger this time. The ocean below seemed to darken, as though the water itself recoiled from the land. From the distance, the faintest echo of something vast and deep groaned beneath the world. Valyria exhaled softly. "It's starting." Karen did not want to believe her. He did not want to believe any of it. And yet, as he looked back toward the heart of Valyria, he could not shake the feeling that the city he had always known, the empire that had ruled for so long, was standing at the edge of something it did not yet understand. Something old. Something waiting. And soon it would wake. The sky over Valyria was darker than it should have been. Clouds of ash and smoke clung to the peaks of the 14 flames, swirling as if stirred by unseen hands. The sun struggled to pierce through, its light dimmed, casting the city in a strange twilight despite the late morning hour. Karen had returned to his forge, but his hands no longer worked with the steady rhythm of habit. The steel in front of him remained unshaped, his hammer resting unused beside it. His mind was elsewhere, on the tremors beneath his feet, on the whispers of dreams that felt too real, on Valina's warning. He should have laughed her off, dismissed her words as the ramblings of a woman lost in superstition. But how could he? When the ground itself shifted beneath him? When the sky carried the scent of something ancient and bitter? Another tremor came, stronger than the last. The tools on his workbench rattled, a stack of ingots toppling to the floor with a heavy clang. Karen braced himself, waiting, breath held, but then it passed. The city outside continued as if nothing had happened. Perhaps that was what unsettled him the most. Valyria did not fear the earth's anger. It was a city built upon fire, carved from the bones of dragons. Its people believed themselves untouchable, their magic and might greater than the forces that shaped the world. But Karen had spent his life in the forge. He knew that even the strongest metal had a breaking point. A sharp knock at his door broke him from his thoughts. He turned to see Dana's, his closest friend, standing in the doorway. A fellow smith, but unlike Karen, who was quiet and thoughtful, Dana's was always full of energy, always ready with a jest. Today, however, his face was drawn, his usual grin absent. "You felt that, didn't you?" Dana's asked. Karen nodded. "Hard not to." Dana stepped inside, lowering his voice. It's getting worse. I was near the southern forges when the last one hit. The ground cracked, Karen. Steam came pouring out, like the mountain itself was breathing. He hesitated, his fingers twitching against his belt. I heard someone say they saw fire in the cracks. Not just heat, actual flames. Karen's stomach twisted. The 14 flames had always burned, but not like that. Not beneath the city itself. You think it means something? Karen asked carefully. Dana's exhaled. I don't know. But something isn't right. He looked toward the open street. And the Dragon Lords act like nothing's happening. They just keep flying their beasts, hosting their feasts, sitting in their golden halls. Because they believed they were gods. That was what no one ever said aloud, but everyone knew. The Dragon Lords saw themselves as more than men, as rulers by divine right, bonded to creatures of flame and sky. Karen turned back to his unfinished blade, his fingers tracing the metal's cooling surface. What do we do? Dana's was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he said, I don't know. But I don't want to be here when we find out. Karen's head snapped up. You're leaving? Dana's hesitated, then nodded. There's a ship leaving for the west tonight. A trader bound for Westeros. It's not meant for passengers, but I've spoken to the captain. He'll take me if I work my passage. Karen stared at him. Dana's had lived in Valyria his entire life, just as he had. The idea of leaving, of abandoning the greatest city the world had ever known, was unthinkable. And yet, what if you're wrong? Karen asked quietly. What if I'm right? Dana's countered. Karen had no answer. Dana studied him for a moment longer. You should come with me. Karen wanted to say no. His life was here, his forge, his work. He was no noble, no dragon lord, but he was Valyrian all the same. To leave the city was to leave everything he had ever known. But then he thought of the whispers in his dreams. The warnings in the fire. The way the ground trembled like something beneath it was trying to break free. I'll think about it, Karen said at last. Dana sighed, but nodded. Meet me at the docks by moonrise if you change your mind. With that, he left, disappearing into the streets. Karen stood in the quiet of his forge, the fire still burning, but its warmth no longer comforting. The tremors grew worse as the day stretched on. By midday, the shaking was strong enough to send dust raining from rooftops, to crack the marble streets in jagged lines. People muttered, glanced uneasily toward the mountains. And still, the Dragon Lords did nothing. Karen made his way through the city, drawn by something he did not understand. His feet carried him toward the eastern cliffs again, where he had spoken with Valyria the day before. He found her standing there once more, her gaze fixed on the horizon. But this time, she was not alone. A dragon stood beside her. It was smaller than the beasts of the great houses, but still powerful, its onyx black scales glinting in the dim light. Its wings were folded neatly at its sides, its golden eyes watching Karen as he approached. Valyria turned. You came. Karen barely heard her, his eyes locked on the dragon. Is it yours? She nodded. Her name is Nyx. Karen had never stood so close to one of the great beasts before. The heat radiating from its body was suffocating, the smell of sulfur thick in the air around it. Valyria studied him. You feel it, don't you? Karen forced his gaze away from the dragon. The tremors? She shook her head. The doom. The word sent a shiver down his spine. Dana's is leaving, he said, as if that might make the truth less real. Valyria was unsurprised. He's smart. Karen clenched his fists. If you know something, tell me. She was quiet for a long moment, then finally said, the Dragon Lords believe they can control everything. Even the fire beneath us. They dig deep into the earth, pulling power from the mountains, shaping it to their will. She exhaled. But they've gone too far. The fire isn't theirs to command. Karen swallowed. And what happens when they lose control? Valyria looked toward the mountains, her expression unreadable. Then Valyria burns. A long silence stretched between them. In the distance, the 14 flames flickered angrily against the sky, their glow brighter than before. Karen had spent his whole life here. He had never wanted to leave. But now, for the first time, he wondered if Valyria was already lost, and if he would survive its end. The night air over Valyria was thick with heat, pressing down like an unseen hand. Though the 14 flames had always burned, their glow had grown wilder, more erratic, illuminating the city with an eerie, flickering light. Karen stood outside his forge, watching the horizon, feeling the weight of something unseen creeping ever closer. He had told himself he wouldn't go to the docks, that this was his home, his life. But the unease in his bones refused to fade. A low rumble trembled through the ground beneath his feet. It was brief, but strong enough to make nearby lanterns sway, to send a fine layer of ash drifting from the rooftops. People in the streets murmured, but no one ran, no one screamed. This was Valyria, such things were normal. Weren't they? Karen turned back toward his forge, trying to focus. He needed to work, to distract himself. But before he could enter, he heard a voice call his name. Karen. Valyria approached swiftly, her silver hair unbound and wild in the hot wind. She looked different, tense, urgent. Behind her, Nyx, her black-scaled dragon, stood watching, golden eyes reflecting the glow of the city. Karen frowned. What is it? She didn't hesitate. The tremors are getting worse. I spoke with one of the lesser dragon lords. He was at the mines beneath the peaks this morning. She took a breath. He said they found something down there. Something they weren't meant to find. Karen stiffened. What does that mean? Valyria glanced around, lowering her voice. There are stories. Old ones. That beneath the 14 flames, something ancient sleeps. The Dragon Lords have always drawn their power from the depths, but there are whispers that they've dug too deep, that they've woken something. Karen's stomach tightened. You need to leave, she continued, her tone firm. Tonight. He shook his head. I can't just leave. My life is here. Your life will mean nothing if the city falls, she said sharply. Karen, please. You've felt it too. You know something is coming. He did. He had felt it for weeks, the way the air itself seemed heavier, the way fire burned hotter. He had seen it in his dreams, in the way the ground trembled like a living thing. But to leave, he thought of Dana's. If he hurried, he could still reach the docks before the ship set sail. But was he truly ready? Before he could answer, the ground beneath them groaned. It was unlike the smaller tremors that had come before. This was something deeper, more violent. Buildings shook, stone walls cracking with sharp, splintering sounds. From the distance, a terrible roar echoed through the streets, unlike anything Karen had ever heard before. People screamed. Valina's dragon Nyx lifted her head, wings unfurling slightly, sensing the change in the air. Karen turned toward the mountains, and his blood ran cold. One of the peaks was crumbling. A massive plume of smoke and fire erupted from its summit, molten rock spilling like blood down its sides. It was as if the mountain itself had been split open from within. Then came the second explosion. And the third. The night sky turned red as fire burst from the earth, consuming everything in its path. The glow of dragon fire had always been a familiar sight in Valyria, but this was different. This fire was not controlled, it was not tamed by man or beast. This fire was chaos. Panic spread through the streets. People ran in every direction, some toward the Dragonlord estates, others toward the harbor. The air filled with the sound of screams, of buildings collapsing, of dragons shrieking as the ground beneath their perches trembled violently. Karen felt himself frozen in place. He had lived here his entire life. This city was supposed to be invincible. But now, it was dying. A hand grabbed his wrist. Karen, move. Valina's voice snapped him back to reality. He looked at her, at the fear in her violet eyes. She wasn't running. She was waiting for him. His choice was made. He ran. Together, they wove through the panicked crowd, moving as fast as they could toward the docks. Around them, the city cracked and crumbled, streets splitting open to reveal rivers of molten rock beneath. A sudden explosion from above sent debris raining down. Karen barely had time to react before Valina pushed him aside. A massive stone crashed where he had just stood, shattering on impact. "Keep going," she yelled. The air grew thick with smoke, making it harder to breathe. The heat was unbearable now, the fire spreading faster than seemed possible. Ahead, the harbor was in chaos, people desperate to flee, ships overcrowded, some already pushing off into the open sea. Karen's heart pounded. Where was Dana's? They reached the docks, only to find fire racing across the wooden planks, ships set ablaze as embers fell from the sky. Then, in the distance, Karen saw him. Dana stood on the deck of a trader's ship, scanning the crowd. When he spotted Karen, his eyes widened. "Karen! Hurry!" Karen grabbed Valina's hand, pulling her forward. They ran toward the ship, the heat at their backs, the air filled with the deafening roar of the burning city. The crew was already untying the ropes. "We're leaving now," the captain shouted. "Get on or stay behind." Karen and Valina reached the edge of the dock. The ship was already pulling away. It was now or never. Without thinking, Karen leaped, grabbing the railing just in time. Strong hands pulled him aboard. He turned back. Valina hesitated. "Jump," he shouted. Behind her, Nyx roared, wings flaring. The fire was too close. With a final breath, Valyria leaped just as Nyx launched into the sky. Karen caught her wrist, pulling her onto the deck as the ship drifted farther from the burning city. The last thing he saw of Valyria was the silhouette of Nyx soaring high above the flames, her wings cutting through the smoke. Then, with a final, earth-shaking roar, the heart of Valyria exploded. The force of it sent shockwaves across the water, nearly capsizing the fleeing ships. A blinding light swallowed the city whole. The sound was indescribable, a mixture of fire and fury, of centuries collapsing in an instant. And then, silence. Karen lay on the deck, staring up at the sky. Ash fell like snow around them. Valyria was gone. He closed his eyes. He had made his choice. But at what cost? The world had changed overnight. Karen stood at the railing of the ship, staring back at the place where Valyria had once stood. But there was nothing left, only a vast, rolling storm of fire and smoke, stretching high into the heavens. The sea itself trembled as the earth continued to crack and heave beneath the waves. The once magnificent city, home to the greatest civilization the world had ever known, had been swallowed whole. Beside him, Valyria clutched the railing, her knuckles white. Her silver hair was streaked with soot, her face smudged with ash. But her violet eyes were fixed on the inferno, unblinking. She hadn't spoken since they boarded the ship. A sharp gust of wind carried the scent of sulfur and death over the water. Even here, miles from the coast, the heat of the Doom could still be felt, pulsing in waves across the sea. The air was thick with floating embers, turning the night sky into a swirling storm of fire and shadow. Karen exhaled, barely realizing he had been holding his breath. "It's gone," he said, though the words felt hollow. Valyria didn't respond. The ship creaked as it rocked against the uneasy waves. Around them, the other passengers, fishermen, traders, and those few lucky enough to have escaped, stood in stunned silence. Some wept. Others clutched at their amulets, whispering prayers to gods who had done nothing to stop this. Dana's approached, his expression grim. "The captain says we'll keep sailing west," he muttered. "No sense in turning back." Karen let out a bitter laugh. "Turn back to what?" Dana's had no answer. For a long time, none of them spoke. The only sounds were the lapping of the water against the hull and the distant, constant rumble of destruction behind them. Finally, Karen turned to Valyria. "What do we do now?" She blinked as if pulled from a dream. Slowly, she looked at him. "We survive," she said. The sun rose behind them, casting a dull, sickly light through the smoke. The sea shimmered with an unnatural glow, reflecting the firestorm still raging in the distance. Karen hadn't slept. He wasn't sure anyone had. Some of the crew spoke in hushed whispers about what had happened. They called it punishment from the gods, the price of Valyria's arrogance. Others spoke of prophecy, of forgotten warnings ignored by the dragon lords. But none of it mattered now. The greatest city in the world was gone, and they were all that remained. Dana's approached again, rubbing a hand over his tired face. "The captain says we're heading for Lys. He thinks we can find safe harbor there." Karen nodded absently. Lys. A city of pleasure and excess. He had never been there himself, but he had heard the stories. Valyria finally stirred. "No. Both men turned to her. No, Dana's repeated, confused. She shook her head. Liz is too close. If the doom spreads, she let the words hang in the air. None of them knew how far the destruction would reach. The free cities might not be safe, Karen realized. Valyria nodded. We need to go farther. Away from Essos. Dana's frowned. You mean Westeros? Karen exchanged a glance with Valyria. Westeros was a land of petty kings and fractured kingdoms, a place where the Dragon Lords had never truly extended their power. But it was also untouched by Valyria's destruction. It might be their only chance. I know a place, Valyria said finally. A land in the west, where some of our kin settled long ago. It's far, but we can reach it. Dana's hesitated, then sighed. I'll speak to the captain. He turned and walked away, leaving Karen alone with Valyria. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Karen broke the silence. You knew this was coming. She looked at him sharply. Not like this. But you knew something. Valyria sighed, her gaze drifting back toward the horizon. There were signs. Whispers in the flames, warnings in the stars. My father saw them too. That's why he sent me away. She exhaled, her fingers tightening against the railing. But the Dragon Lords, they thought themselves untouchable. They ignored the omens. And now, they're gone. Karen studied her. Not all of them. Valyria met his gaze. No, not all. For the first time since the doom, a flicker of something passed between them. Not fear. Not grief. Something else. Hope. The ship sailed westward, away from the ruins of Valyria. For days, they drifted through an ocean of ash, the sky dark and heavy, the air thick with the remnants of a world that no longer existed. But by the time the smoke began to fade and the first clear stars returned to the sky, Karen knew. The age of Valyria was over. But something new was beginning. The sea stretched endlessly before them, a vast expanse of deep blue, touched only by the golden light of a rising sun. For the first time since the doom, the sky was clear, free of smoke and fire. The wind was strong, filling the ship's sails as they pressed westward, leaving behind the ruin of what once was. Karen stood at the stern, hands gripping the railing, watching the last wisps of Valyria's destruction fade on the horizon. He had spent his whole life in the shadow of the 14 flames, forging steel beneath their glow. Now, he was adrift, a man without a home. The weight of it settled in his chest. The realization that there would be no going back. Valyria approached, silent as a ghost. Her silver hair, streaked with soot and salt, caught the morning light. For days, she had spoken little, but her presence had remained steady, an unbroken pillar amid the storm. She stood beside him, gazing out at the horizon. Do you regret leaving? Karen exhaled. I didn't have a choice. No, she agreed. You didn't. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the rhythmic creaking of the ship. Finally, she asked, what will you do now? Karen shook his head. I don't know. It was the truth. He had no fortune, no land. His forge, his work, all of it had been lost in the fire. What did a man do when everything he had built was turned to ash? Valina's violet eyes lingered on him. You could forge again. He let out a bitter laugh. Where? For whom? Westeros, she said simply. He turned to her. You truly think we can find a home there? She hesitated, but then nodded. There is a place. A land where some of our kin settled long ago. Dragonstone. It is not Valyria, but it is strong. And in time, she trailed off, her gaze fixed on something distant. Karen frowned. In time, what? She looked at him, her expression unreadable. Valyria is gone. But that does not mean its fire must die. Her words sent a shiver through him. He had heard the stories, the prophecies whispered among the dragon lords. That fire and blood would never truly be extinguished. That from the ashes, something new could rise. Before he could respond, a voice called from above. Ship on the horizon. Karen and Valina turned sharply. The crew erupted into motion, sailors rushing to the bow, eyes scanning the sea. Dana's appeared beside them, his face grim. Could be Lysini traitors, he muttered. Or worse. Karen's jaw tightened. Pirates. Even in the wake of the doom, the world did not stop turning. The seas remained dangerous, filled with those who would prey on the desperate. And there was no one more desperate than the survivors of Valyria. The ship drew closer, its sails dark and tattered. It was moving fast. The captain of their vessel barked orders, the crew arming themselves with what little they had, rusty swords, wooden clubs, a few bows with limited arrows. Against seasoned raiders, it would not be enough. Karen clenched his fists. He had no weapon. His sword had been lost in the chaos of the docks. Valina, however, remained eerily calm. Karen turned to her. Do you have a plan? She simply lifted her head and whistled. A distant roar answered. Karen's heart leapt into his throat as a shadow fell across the deck. From above, Nyx descended, the great black dragon circling once before landing on the stern, her golden eyes fixed on the approaching ship. The raiders hesitated. Even from this distance, Karen could see their uncertainty, the way they slowed. They didn't know we had a dragon, Valina murmured. Karen watched as she stepped forward, her posture regal, commanding. They know now. The enemy ship veered, turning hard, breaking off its pursuit. The sight of Nyx had been enough. Karen exhaled. The world had changed. The dragon lords had fallen. But dragons still lived. And as long as they did, Valyria's legacy was not entirely lost. Valina turned to him, the faintest trace of a smile playing at her lips. Come, she said. We still have far to go. And with that, the ship pressed westward, toward a land unknown, toward the future that awaited them. The wind howled across the deck, whipping through the sails as the ship cut through the churning sea. The sky had darkened over the past few hours, heavy clouds rolling in from the west, swallowing the last golden hues of the sun. The ocean grew restless beneath them, waves rising, crashing against the hull. Karen tightened his grip on the railing, his jaw set. The air smelled of rain and salt, thick with the promise of a storm. From the helm, the captain barked orders to his crew. Reef the sails. Brace the lines. This storm's going to hit hard. Sailors scrambled, their boots thudding against the wooden planks as they hauled ropes and secured cargo. Some cast worried glances toward the sky, muttering prayers to whatever gods might listen. Valyria stood near the mast, her silver hair snapping in the wind, her violet eyes locked on the horizon. Karen made his way to her, steadying himself against the lurching deck. "This storm will be bad," he said, raising his voice over the wind. Valyria nodded, but she did not look afraid. If anything, she looked thoughtful, as if listening to something only she could hear. "Nyx is restless," she murmured. Karen glanced toward the stern, where the great black dragon perched, her wings partially unfurled for balance. She shifted uneasily, her tail coiling around the wooden beams. Dragons did not fear storms, but they could sense the shifting air, the change in pressure before the sky broke open. Dana's joined them, wiping rain from his brow. "The captain says we're caught in it now. No turning back." As if in response, the heavens opened. Rain poured down in torrents, drenching them instantly. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the roiling clouds in flashes of white fire. Thunder cracked like the roar of a god, shaking the very bones of the ship. The sea surged, lifting the vessel high before dropping it into a deep trough. Wood groaned under the strain. A wave crashed over the deck, sending barrels and loose crates tumbling. Karen barely managed to keep his footing. Around him, men shouted, clinging to whatever they could. "Get below deck," the captain bellowed. "Now!" Valyria didn't move. Her gaze was still fixed ahead, through the sheets of rain. Karen touched her arm. "Come on. It's too dangerous up here." She turned to him, and for the first time, he saw something flicker in her expression. Not fear, but certainty. "No," she said. "We must stay." Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment, Karen saw something beyond the rain. A shape. His breath caught. Through the storm, another ship loomed in the distance. No, ships. Dark silhouettes against the horizon, their sails black against the flashing sky. "Gods," Dana's breathed. "We're not alone." Karen's mind raced. Who would be mad enough to sail in a storm like this? The answer came quickly. Raiders. Not the desperate kind they had frightened off before. These were prepared. These were waiting. They've been following us, Karen realized. Valyria's jaw tightened. And they think the storm will give them the advantage. A new sound joined the wind and waves, the deep, rhythmic beat of war drums. It echoed over the water, barely audible over the storm, but steady. A warning. Karen turned sharply to the captain. "Weapons. Now." The man's face darkened, but he nodded. Sailors moved swiftly, passing out swords and bows, though the latter would be nearly useless in the wind and rain. The enemy ships were closing fast. Another bolt of lightning illuminated their hulls, sleek, fast vessels, built for raiding. Their prows were carved into the shapes of snarling beasts. Figures moved along their decks, dark shadows against the flickering light. Karen set his feet, gripping the hilt of his borrowed sword. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to steady his breath. The first ship came alongside them with terrifying speed. Grappling hooks flew, latching onto the railings. The raiders moved like ghosts, leaping onto the deck before the ships had even fully collided. The battle began in an instant. Steel clashed. Voices roared. The ship lurched violently as more raiders poured over the side. Karen met the first attacker head-on, blocking a wild swing with his blade. The force sent vibrations up his arm, but he held firm, shoving the man back before driving his sword forward. The raider fell with a wet gasp. Around him, the crew fought desperately. These were not trained soldiers. Many were sailors, merchants, fishermen. But they fought for their lives. A flash of silver caught his eye, Valyria. She moved through the chaos like a shadow, her short blade flashing in the stormlight. One raider lunged at her, but she twisted out of the way, driving her dagger into his side. But there were too many. Another ship slammed into them from the other side, more raiders spilling onto the deck. The crew was being overwhelmed. Lightning cracked overhead, and in that moment, Karen knew what had to be done. "Valyria," he called. She turned, her face streaked with rain and blood. He gestured toward the stern, where Nyx still crouched, her wings flaring against the wind. Her eyes widened in understanding. Karen turned, cutting down another attacker before making his way toward the dragon. He felt rather than saw Valyria moving behind him. A raider stepped in front of him, raising an axe. Karen barely managed to parry in time. The force of the blow sent him staggering. The raider grinned, lifting the axe for another strike. Before he could swing, Nyx roared. The sound shattered the storm, a deep, earth-shaking bellow that sent both friend and foe stumbling. Karen took his chance. He drove his sword up into the raider's chest. The man crumpled. Valyria reached Nyx first, her hand pressing against the dragon's scaled neck. She whispered something, her voice lost to the storm. And then, Nyx moved. The black dragon unfurled her wings, powerful despite the wind. With a leap, she launched into the air, soaring above the ship. A shadow passed over the deck. Then, fire. Bright, golden flames erupted from Nyx's maw, engulfing the nearest raider ship. Wood splintered. Men screamed. The storm turned red with firelight. Karen didn't stop. He turned back to the battle, driving forward, striking down another foe. Around him, the tide was turning. The raiders faltered, their formation breaking as the realization hit them they had not planned for this. One of their ships was already sinking. Another was ablaze. Panic spread among them. Some turned and fled, scrambling back toward their ships. Nyx roared again, swooping low, her fire cutting off their retreat. Karen panted, sword dripping with rain and blood. The battle was over. The raiders who remained alive threw down their weapons. Some leapt overboard, vanishing into the dark waves. Others fell to their knees, surrendering. Karen turned to Valyria. She stood tall beside Nyx, her face impassive, but he could see the fire in her eyes. They had survived, but they had been tested. And Karen knew now there was no going back. Valyria was gone, and the world would soon know that its last survivors would not fall quietly. The sea had quieted. The storm had passed, leaving only the steady lapping of waves against the battered hull. Smoke still rose from the wreckage of the raiders' ships, drifting across the water in lazy spirals. The smell of charred wood and burnt flesh lingered in the air. Karen stood near the bow, gripping the railing, his body aching from battle. He exhaled slowly, watching as the first light of dawn painted the sky in hues of soft pink and gold. They had survived. The crew moved around him, tending to the wounded, repairing what they could. The ship bore the scars of the fight, deep gashes in the wood, broken railings, blood staining the deck, but it still floated. That was enough. Dana's approached, his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage. "Captain says we'll make it to Dragonstone within 2 days," he said. "If the winds favor us." Karen nodded, letting the words sink in. Dragonstone. A name spoken in Valyria long ago, a place distant and unknown. But now, it was the only destination that mattered. The only place left where they could build something new. Valyria emerged from the shadows of the mast, Nyx crouched beside her. The dragon's black scales gleamed in the morning light, her golden eyes unblinking as she watched the horizon. "She's restless," Valyria murmured, stroking Nyx's neck. "She knows we're close." Karen turned to her. "And you?" She met his gaze, something unreadable flickering in her violet eyes. "I was born in a land of fire and mountains, but I have never seen Dragonstone." He nodded, understanding what she meant. They were Valyrian, yet they were strangers to the land that now waited for them. Dana sighed, rolling his injured shoulder. "I just hope it's not another ruin. We've seen enough of those." Valyria shook her head. "Dragonstone still stands." Karen studied her. "You're certain?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her gaze to the east, back toward the sea they had crossed, toward the place they had left behind. "Valyria is dead," she said softly. "But we are not." Silence settled between them, the weight of her words sinking deep. Karen finally spoke. "Then let's make sure we do not waste what we have left." The journey was slow, the ship weary from battle, but the sea remained calm. Each day, the air grew colder, the skies darker. And then, at last, on the second evening, they saw it. A shadow on the horizon. At first, it was nothing more than a jagged silhouette, rising from the sea like the broken teeth of some great beast. But as they drew closer, the details emerged: dark stone, towering walls, a castle carved from the bones of the earth itself. Dragonstone. Karen felt something shift in his chest. The fortress was unlike Valyria's shining towers, its black stone rough and unyielding, shaped by fire and time. It was not beautiful. It was not grand. But it was strong. The ship docked at the crumbling harbor, its sails folding like the wings of a tired bird. The crew disembarked cautiously, stepping onto the cold stone of a new home. Karen followed, his boots echoing against the worn path leading toward the castle's gates. The air was thick with the scent of salt and ash. The island was dormant now, its volcanoes slumbering, but the bones of the past still lingered beneath the surface. As they climbed the path, a voice called out from the walls. "Halt!" Figures emerged from the shadows, armored men with swords drawn. Their sigils bore a familiar mark, a three-headed dragon. Valyrians. A tall man stepped forward, his silver hair tied back, his face lined with age but still sharp with strength. His violet eyes flickered over them, lingering on Nyx, on Valyria, on the worn state of their company. "Who are you?" he demanded. Valyria stepped forward. We are what remains. The man studied her for a long moment. Then, at last, he nodded. Welcome to Dragonstone. That night, they gathered in the great hall. The castle was sparse, its halls echoing with emptiness, but the fire still burned in its hearth. The Valyrians who had come before them, those who had settled here generations ago, listened as Valyria spoke. She told them of the doom, of the fire that had consumed their home, of the destruction that had swallowed the empire whole, of how they had survived. When she finished, silence hung in the air. The gathered Valyrians exchanged glances, some grim, some thoughtful. Finally, the silver-haired man, Lord Enar Valyrian, spoke. Valyria is gone, he said. The freehold is ash. The empire will not rise again. His voice was steady, but there was something else beneath it. Something deep and unspoken. Hope. Valyria met his gaze. No, it will not rise again. She looked around the room at the tired faces, the weary eyes. But fire still burns, she said. Enar studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. Then let us tend to it well. That night, Karen stood on the castle's balcony, looking out over the dark sea. Dragonstone was no Valyria, but it was something. He felt Valina's presence beside him before she spoke. You believe we can build here? Karen exhaled. I don't know. She tilted her head. Do you want to? He thought of the forge he had lost, the city that had burned, the home that was now nothing more than whispers on the wind. Then he looked down at his hands, scarred from years of forging steel. I think I do. Valyria nodded. Karen glanced at her. And you? What do you want? She didn't answer immediately. She looked out toward the sky, toward the moonlit sea. Then, softly, she said, I want our fire to never go out. A cool breeze drifted across the balcony, carrying the scent of salt and smoke. Karen watched as Nyx unfurled her wings in the courtyard below, stretching them against the night sky. For the first time since the doom, Karen felt something stir in his chest. Not sorrow. Not fear. Something else. A beginning. He turned back to the dark horizon, where the world stretched before them, vast and waiting. Valyria had died, but they had not. And as long as dragons still flew, as long as their fire still burned, the world had not yet seen the last of them. The end. The flames have faded, and Valyria is now nothing more than a memory, a story written in ash and fire. Once, it stood as the greatest empire the world had ever known, its power unmatched, its glory unquestioned. But even the mightiest fall, and in a single day, all was lost, swallowed by fire, shattered by the doom. Yet, not all that is lost is forgotten. The survivors sail toward a new horizon, carrying with them the last embers of their fallen home. They have lost their land, but not their purpose. As long as dragons still fly, as long as fire still burns, their legacy endures. The world changes, always shifting, always moving. What is old will crumble, and from the ruins, something new will rise. And even in the darkest night, a small flame still flickers, waiting for the dawn. Now, it is time to rest. Let this story drift into your dreams, warm your soul like a fire that never fades. Sleep well, And when morning comes, a new world will be waiting.